All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Mike Ayalon. I am the CEO of Greek University. Thank you for joining us today. Our objectives today in this town hall are to, number one, educate professional staff on the challenges facing African American students in the wake of the Ahmaud Arbery incident. We also want to place the Ahmaud Arbery incident in its proper context, given the long history of vigilantism, over policing, unfair targeting, and also unconscious bias towards African Americans and also other people of color. We'd like to provide a space for dialogue around this and some of the other incidents of racial bias. We'd like to educate professional staff on how to support students who may be struggling with feelings of belonging and safety in the wake of society racial bias. If any of our town hall participants have any questions that they want to ask of the panelists, feel free to put that in the chat box, and we'll try our best to get those questions answered for you before the end of the program. So I'm outraged. Racism is happening over and over and again in our country with no end in sight. It's very apparent because of video in a string of incidents in the news, all happening alongside this pandemic of coronavirus that is also infecting and killing the Black community disproportionately. I wanted to go over a few of the recent cases because I know that we're going to be using these names throughout this town hall today, and I want to make sure that everybody at least has that foundation of understanding some of the facts and some of the names of the people that we're going to be discussing. The first, of course, is Ahmaud Arbery. On February 23rd, the young Black jogger was passing through a predominantly white Satilla Shores section of Brunswick, Georgia. Arbery stopped in front of a still unfinished home. He went inside briefly before resuming his run. A former police officer and his son, both residents on that street, had become rather preoccupied with young men caught on security cameras that were trespassing on that particular site. Some of the video was posted on the neighborhood's Facebook page. Armed with a shotgun and a handgun, the father and son later followed Arbery in their truck. One of them shot him to death during a confrontation, and the video of the killing went viral on social media. We're also going to be talking about Brianna Taylor. Brianna was a 26-year-old emergency medical technician, an EMT, who was shot and killed by Louisville Metro Police on March 13th during a late-night raid on her home, where her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, was also sleeping. Walker was arrested and charged with attempted homicide on accusations that he shot one of the police officers during that particular raid. George Floyd. George died shortly after he was apprehended by Minneapolis police on Monday of this week, after disturbing video emerged on social media showing a police officer with his knee on the man's neck as the man repeatedly yells out on camera, "I can't breathe." Then there's the case of Christian Cooper. Christian was in a patch of dense trees and shrubs known as the Ramble on Monday in Central Park, New York City, which is popular with bird watchers and where signs say that dogs must be kept on a leash. When Cooper asked a woman to leash her exuberant dog, she said that she would call the police. She said, "I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life," she said. As the woman became agitated, Cooper remained calm and recorded part of the incident. Police officers attended the call but said that no summonses or arrests were made over what the New York Police Department called a verbal dispute. Those are some of the incidents we're going to be talking about today. I want to start with some introductions of our panelists. Today with us, we have an expert on racial equity. We have a diversity peer educator giving us the student perspective in all of this. We have a diversity and inclusion expert with us. We also have a former Greek advisor and a higher education professional giving us that professional staff perspective. So let's start with Cecilia Olusola Tribble. Please introduce yourself so that way we know a little bit more about you.
Hi, everyone. Good to be with you all. As Michael said, I'm Cecilia Olusola Tribble. I am in Nashville. Most of my work revolves around institutional change with nonprofits, arts and culture organizations, and faith organizations. And my focus is how do we shift from the basic diversity training to institutional change? Another feature of my work is walking people through the terminology. Once we get hit with this new terminology, it can be life altering and an emotional experience. How do we juggle the real feelings along with making sure our feelings don't stop us from moving forward? So my tagline is expanding the institutional imagination and really taking the limits off of the ways in which we've all been colonized by white supremacy.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll go next to Morgan Williams. Please introduce yourself.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Morgan Williams, and I am actually a class of 2020 University of Michigan graduate. I studied sociology, but it's funny, in my family, they say I've always been a sociologist, but now I've got the paper to prove it. So when I was in college, I worked as a diversity peer educator. And basically, just to make it simple, that's someone who basically is an RA, but has a diversity, equity, and inclusion focus. So a lot of my work was programming, it was relationship building, it was counseling students around diversity, equity, inclusion, and bringing social justice into the dorm. So being that additional piece, just to make sure that everyone is feeling seen, feeling safe, feeling represented. And this conversation is just important to me because I'm a sociologist, but I'm a Black woman first. I'm someone's daughter, I'm someone's, older sister. So these issues are very central to my family life, and I hope to bring, that diverse perspective to this conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. Robert Wilson, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Again, my name is Robert Wilson. It's cool for me because I began my D&I journey exactly where Morgan is finishing at the University of Michigan doing diversity peer educator work. So moved on to a corporate career. Eventually was the diversity inclusion leader at Nissan North America before starting with two partners, my own firm, Culture Shift Team. And so we do work in the D&I space around culture, around diversity strategy, around diversity training. And also I had the honor of working with Mike as well through Greek University, doing speaking on college campuses in the D&I space.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, Robert. And last but certainly not least, Edson O'Neill. Please introduce yourself.
Good morning, everybody. Again, thank you for taking the time for attending this virtual town hall with us this morning. Again, my name is Edson O'Neill. I'm originally from St. Croix of the U.S. Virgin Islands. I grew up there, I was born and raised, and now I reside in Tampa, Florida. I worked on higher education. My realm in there is typically around student activities, working advising, student government, programming, fraternity sorority life, community engagement, leadership development, and pretty much everything under the sun. So I work with Mike as well on Greek University. I am a speaker. I talk about areas in regards to leadership, vulnerability, bullying, and the history of stepping and strolling. I'm a member of Alpha Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. And this topic is important to me as well because being an African-American male, especially growing up on the islands, it's very important that we have these conversations and that we help educate and help promote, social justice, and that, we're all one. And I especially want to empower our African-American males and females, the youth. Seeing them going through stuff like this, they wonder, will this ever end? How can I cope with this? What can I do to build change? So I'm really here to kind of help give them the resources and pretty much motivate them and support them in building that change.
Wonderful. Thank you for being with us today, Edson. Again, my name is Mike Ayalon. I'm the CEO for Greek University. A little bit different, obviously, than our panelists, but bringing institutional change to college campuses in the areas of hazing prevention, sexual assault prevention, and also alcohol and drug abuse prevention since starting the company in 2015. Diversity in student organizations is something that I'm very passionate about, so I'm certainly honored to be moderating this important discussion today with some exceptional panelists. So this is going to be incredible. First, I want to start with a very basic question, which is, what was your initial reaction after seeing the Ahmaud Arbery video? So Cecilia, if you can walk us through what your first thoughts were when you saw that video.
I didn't watch it because as I, after so many killings of Black people in the United States, particularly in recent years, I am keenly aware of the effects on my own body and making sure my mental and physical health stay intact is a way that I personally believe that we can fight against the ways in which white supremacy and patriarchy are constantly seeking to kill us. So like, I read the stories, I've seen the still images, but the live video, I can't see it. And when the news plays it out, I immediately change the channel because I don't want my son to see it. I think the normalization of Black death is something that, you know, as a mom, we just don't need. However, my reaction, and that's my reaction of like, I must protect myself and my son and my mom. We lived with my mother. And so we haven't watched it. However, it was, you know, also my impulse to say something about it. And we'll get into that later, but I didn't watch it.
Okay, very good. Morgan, what did you think when you saw that video?
So I also was someone who kind of avoided the video for a long time. I saw the images, I saw the hashtags, I saw different things that my friends would like bring into our conversations. But for a long time, I did not want to watch the video. I actually saw the video by accident. And when I did see it, it was one of those, like, when your stomach just sinks all the way down. My anxiety instantly skyrocketed when I heard the details. And then I was filled with some anger once I familiarized myself with it and I realized that it happened months ago. So there's just like a mixture of feelings, but it definitely brought one of those clouds of, man, grief, angst, we can't do anything in this country. And a lot of worry, I found myself reaching out to, you know, my friends who are Black, who live in neighborhoods like mine that are majority white. I was telling my brother, you know, this is why you have to be safe. So it just ushered in that caution that's always in the back of your head, but it brought it to the forefront again.
Yeah. Hey, Robert, what did you think when you saw that video?
You know, the interesting thing is we talked as a panel and we didn't discuss that none of us wanted to watch the video because I also was reluctant to watch the video. I may not have watched that video if not for this panel, because, you know, it felt like more of the same. And, you know, why do I have to see this again? Even though I understand the importance of, you know, people being able to see that and understand from you know, the truth about where it's coming from. Beyond that, my reaction upon hearing about the incident was, I think there was some fear there. I think, you know, I live in a community that's, you know, where I can go days without seeing someone that looks like me that's not homeless. And so even in my everyday interactions, you start to wonder, you know, about your own safety. And that seems like it's just a really bizarre thing for me to say because, you know, I'm in a well-populated area, but you do think about that. I also travel a lot, and I travel a lot by car. And so, you know, I drive through these small, you know, communities, north, south, east, and west. And, you know, it made me think about my own safety during the time, you know, when I get out of the car for gas or when it's starting to get late, you know, those things. And I think the other thing I take from it is that there's always this sense of in the media and from those who, don't believe these incidents, there's always this sense of, what were they doing before the camera was rolling, or what was, it had to be something, right? Because no one just shoots someone in cold blood. And there's been, if you go back, to just go back in recent history, 2015, in these incidents, there are cases where you can watch the video and you can't figure out what the person did wrong. And when you consider it that way, it starts to feel like, I'm just hunted, regardless of whether I follow all the rules or I follow, or I try to protect myself, or you just feel that way. And that's really sad. I think it's sad in 2020 for me or for anyone to feel that way about, everyday interactions.
Yeah, thank you. Edson, I know that you really were pushing to have this discussion, so I'm sure that you had some reactions when you saw the Ahmaud Arbery video. What did you think when you saw it? Hold on one sec.
Yeah, I'm good. Yeah, sure. Yeah, so when I first saw the video, I really didn't know what was going on. So I'm part of a few group chats, and I saw on social media all the hashtags, and so I didn't really know what was going on. And someone mentioned a video out there, so I looked up because I wanted to see and know what is everyone talking about. And then I first saw the video, and I was like, this is what's happening. So I actually watched it a couple of times to fully to fully understand, did this really happen? Because when I first saw it, I couldn't really believe it. So my instant reaction was just disbelief. The fact that, to what everyone said, he was being hunted. So the things that was going through my head, can I run through a park, and do I have to worry about someone, trying to come after me or chasing me down or whatever the case is? Some of the group chats that I'm a part of, some of the younger Black men that I speak with was asking about, do I need to get a gun, because so that I can protect myself. So that really hit me. Like, wow, like these young men are like, do I have to leave my house, my apartment, my place with a gun so that I can protect myself? So that's what kind of sparked me to kind of host something like this, because I think we need an avenue to where people can talk about this, can share thoughts, ideas, how they're feeling, maybe give them support of kind of how to handle the situation and what to do. So props to Robert for finding Morgan and Cecilia to give amazing feedback, and I'm very honored to be a part of this panel. But for me, it was just really disbelief, and I just couldn't believe that actually happened and how it happened, and all these questions raised. What was the person doing there taking the video? How did he get there? Like, why did this happen in February? Why are we only seeing it in May? Like, all these things that I was asking myself, like, why, how? And I just couldn't really come to grips of how or why everything happened. So that really sparked me to get with you and to get with Rob to have something like this, so that it can be a way for us to kind of talk about and to kind of educate and learn more and help people to cope.
Thank you for sharing. We appreciate that. Let's get to some of the higher ed perspective. Morgan, you're a graduate of 2020 at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Morgan, what are some of the challenges that African-American students face at predominantly white institutions related to racial bias?
So this was something that I kind of had to draw on a lot of my older experience. So I kind of took myself back to freshman year. And there were many moments where like I would be in a classroom or be in a lecture hall and feel like, either I'm invisible, nobody really notices who I am because, I'm outnumbered, or there's a spotlight on me. I need to act a certain way. I need to prove myself, even though I'm sure, there was some anxiety in that. I think that kind of hyper visibility or invisibility kind of comes with my identity as a Black woman. Also having to deal with microaggressions and having to explain constantly why these things are wrong or justify my trauma. I remember there was a moment where we had an incident. It was not physical, but somebody was distributing racist flyers and having to explain to professionals that this hurts, even though it is not a physical threat on my life. It makes me feel like I'm less than, makes me feel inferior. So constantly feeling like you have to prove yourself and that your pain is real. And also from a mental perspective, I dealt with a lot of anxiety, just consuming the news, consuming different things that were happening, not on our campus, but across the country or across the world, that just really made me feel othered, made me feel like I didn't belong, and trying to figure out how I need to carry on, because at the end of the day, I do need to get this degree. I'm here for a reason. So those kinds of challenges, even though they might be felt by the collective, weigh really heavy on the individual. And I think as an African-American student on a campus like Michigan, where we're about 4%, it just heightens all of those complicated emotions.
Okay, thank you. Edson, same question to you. What are some of the challenges African-American students face at predominantly white institutions related to racial bias?
Yeah, working at a PWI, with my experiences working with students of color, they feel their voice is not being heard. They feel like they constantly have to go above and beyond. They hear work to get their voice heard, to get their point across. They feel they're not taken seriously. So as a person of color in a high administration role, it's my ability to make sure that they are heard. So if the students are not being heard, making sure like, hey, here are some of the students' concerns, here are some of the things that they're going through, here are some of the things that we need to do, and being that outlet for them. And even if they feel they're not being heard, being that support system for them so that they can vent, they can talk to, they can, kind of share some of the grief, and to some students, that's more important than if they're not heard by the administration, knowing that they have someone of color that they can go to and that they can share their experiences with is something that they cherish, but just with working with students of color, and to a lot of what Morgan said, just feeling the voice is not being heard and that they're devalued and they're just a number. So universities would say, oh, we need more diversity. We need more African American students. We need more Hispanics. We need more people from the Caribbean. Like, we need more students of color. But when you get them, what are you doing to make sure that you're providing the resources for them to retain them at the university? So it is just them not feeling heard and feeling that they're just a number.
Okay,
Hey, Mike,
thank you.
if I could add something to that, I was thinking as Edson was talking, one of the great skills that I had to learn as a diversity peer educator, all those years ago, that has carried me, been a really important value add for me in my career, and then finally in doing diversity inclusion work, is the ability to be present for people who are not like you. So what I mean by that is, I was an African-American struggling with many of the same things that, African-American students are struggling with today. But in that role, I had to be present for, the white student who maybe made a comment that he or she may not understand why that was offensive. And it might have been directed towards African-Americans. And so I've got to put aside my own pain and take this moment to educate that student. Or, it may have been something that was said to a gay student that I may not be able to relate to, but I still have to be present for it. So, to the folks on the line that are doing this work, I think, one, you have a responsibility to learn, I think, how to be present for all of the people that all the students that you're serving. But then if you're not serving students, I think it has helped me in my career when I was managing people who were not like me, to be able to sit down with them and be able to ask questions and be curious and say, I don't know what you're going through. Can you tell me more? Can you explain? Can you help me understand? So I think that's a skill that all of us could probably get better at. I still have work to do, but I've had a lot of years of working on it.
Excellent.
If
Thank
I
you.
could jump in also, and to, I guess, tag team on what Morgan was saying about, racist propaganda on college campuses, and something that I certainly experienced as a graduate student, as a divinity student at Vanderbilt University, which is a PWI, and also on NYU's campus, is that while it may not seem threatening, it is threatening in the long term, because you get this propaganda and then people go out and believe it and then enact it. And we can't think that these incidents of racial violence that we brought up when the Marbury incident with Taylor, with um, um, Cooper, all of these other people, those people were taught and socialized into white supremacist thinking somewhere. And so that is not only um, hard to combat because you can't see it immediately, but those seeds are planted. Also, it's dangerous to students because of weathering. You mentioned anxiety, and I mean, you're not the only one, right? Whenever we see something racist, um, whenever I live in Nashville, in the northwest corner of the county, and on the county line is a gas station with neo-Nazi and Confederate flag propaganda, right? And every time I have to drive by it, I have to think that it is anxiety producing to me. And studies have showed that weathering of constant racism is affecting the way our bodies can heal, is affecting high blood pressure, diabetes, risk for heart attack and stroke. And so we can't see these incidents as just an incident. It is life altering for people of color, particularly Black folks, when we are constantly bombarded with racist incidents on campuses and out in the world. And so my question would be to, as a parent, would be, how are college campuses not only invested in my child's education, but with keeping their psyche safe on those campuses?
Cecilia, could you give us a little bit of a historical perspective? Because I want to put this incident in perspective, in context. What's the connection between this incident with Ahmaud Arbery and past incidents of bias or vigilantism?
Let me see, in 1 minute.
Tough, I know.
Well, I mean, there is a connection between perceived whiteness as authority and vigilantism, and the ways in which people of color, but specifically Black people, are surveilled and policed. Really going all the way back before the founding of the United States to colonial Maryland and Virginia, and to look up, I encourage everybody to look up those gun laws that were set in colonial Virginia specifically. But there is a moment where we always talk about the Second Amendment as a right. And, for the past 180 years, folks have gone back in the Supreme Court of who has the right to have a gun. And there was a deal that James Madison, actually read this morning, so I could say this, made with the South that allowed slave owners to have militias on their plantations, so there wouldn't be the threat of a revolt, right? They were concerned about white people from the North coming and helping slaves to revolt against them. And so you have that, and then you have the Fugitive Slave Act some 60 years later, yeah, well, like 1850 or something like that. Don't around then. And where you have militias of white people returning property, right? Which are people, property. And then you have bands of white people stealing people and making them property. I think one of the most famous cases is Solomon Northrup. I don't know if y'all seen 12 Years a Slave. I encourage y'all to read the book first and then watch the movie. And so you have all of these things mixed together, and then post-slavery into Reconstruction, you have not so latent racial rage of now these people are free and they're stealing our jobs and all of this, but you have the law enforcement and vigilantes working together in order to control and to kill a perceived threat of Black folks rising. And not just Black folks. I mean, if you watch Asian Americans documentary that was just on PBS that was playing, it talked about how, specifically Chinese folks were lynched in the Western United States, California, Oregon. And so you have the law enforcement and vigilantes lynching people who they feel as a threat to their thriving economically. And so it is both economics and the tool of white supremacy feed into each other. And the idea that whiteness is normal, standard, good, and the authority is always our ideas that are always working together.
Got it. Robert, do you have any other thoughts on that as well in terms of the connection between this most recent incident and past incidents of bias or vigilantism?
Yeah, I think Cecilia really articulates it really well.
Yeah.
I can put it in terms of, real incidents, right? And I think some of you have heard kind of my story, that my great-grandfather was actually lynched. He was an auto mechanic in the 1920s, and he was traveling, fixing cars on plantations where Blacks were sharecroppers. And he was educating those sharecroppers about how they were being robbed and what they were getting paid for their work. And word got out around the time, this was in northwest part of Mississippi, and the whites in the community lynched him to stop him from sharing that information with other Black sharecroppers. And that was in the mid-1920s. Around then, we still have actually the newspaper clippings from what happened in 1932, where there was a murder of a white person in this town in northwest Mississippi. And there was a rumor that some relatives of mine were harboring the person who had committed the murder. And so a posse showed up with weapons loaded. They tried to get my family to let the person out of the house. There was something happened and they opened fire. And I always say, I don't know who opened fire first, but I do know that everybody that was in the home was shot and killed, including a disabled child in the house. And of course, when they went in the house, the person that they thought was harboring was not there. They found out that someone else had committed the murder, and there was never any justice for the family, in that incident. So, if you start drawing a line between, colonial Maryland and Virginia to Ahmaud Arbery, you start seeing some really dangerous similarities. And I think you start to say somehow this kind of thing is permeated into our society and culture, and that all of us collectively are allowing it to happen. But in particular, I think the majority population and this authority that has been established, which is primarily the white population, I think has some work to do to extend privilege, which is something I talk about a lot in the work that I do, extending privilege and really not standing for this anymore, because I think it's the people in the majority who are going to have to step up and say, this is the last video we're seeing, period. We're not seeing any more of these videos. Okay, we're going to do whatever it takes to stop this kind of thing from happening. We thought that the videos would be the thing But, you know, just in the same way the civil rights, television was the technology that changed the country with respect to civil rights, because people could see these kids being water hosed and dogs unleashed on after them. In this era, we've seen the videos which are changing the conversation, but the odd thing is that there's this talk of, again, what happened before the video was rolling, or maybe it was this inability to accept what you see with your own eyes. But I think, you know, we collectively have work to do as a society, but I think there's an outsized role for the white population, who have allowed these systemic things that date way back in history to continue way more than they should.
Thank you. Morgan, what are some ways in which these killings impact African-American students at predominantly white campus environments?
I think Cecilia honestly touched on that with her speaking from the parents' perspective of worrying, you know, whether or not her kid is going to be safe and whether the institution invests in that safety. I know, like, right before I went to college, it was, I entered college summer of 2016. So that summer, there were a lot of high profile unarmed killings. I think that was the year that Philando Castile was killed. I'm not sure, but either way, these things were already in my mind and they were in my parents' minds. So I remember when I was in high school, I never had to share my location. I have my location shared with a whole lot of family members just because they want to know that I'm safe. It can change depending on like where you go to school. I went to school in an urban area. Ann Arbor is fairly diverse. For the most part, I didn't have to encounter any overt racism, like I kind of expected to, just because I was on guard. But depending on where you go to school, it could change the areas that you go to. Like if you go to school in Florida where they have the stand your ground law, that could change the way that you interact with the community that's outside of your campus. So I think that in the microcosm that is college, if you're lucky enough to find the community that supports you, you might find yourself shielded from a lot of that. But there definitely is a sense of danger that might follow you. Those worries that, okay, this police who sees me wearing a hoodie walking down the street might think that I'm not a college student. You know, this person who asked for my university card when I'm walking in the library is questioning whether or not I should be there. So in turn, that might make me question whether or not I should be there. So it's just that sense of safety, that sense of security, that sense of literally security in the sense that I am allowed to be here because I am a college student, because I'm a person. And seeing the disparate treatment, it could just change the entire way that you interact with that and others in that space. It could change who you network with. I remember, I hate to ramble, but getting to college, I was used to having a diverse social circle. When I got to college, it made me stick to my kind just a little bit more. So until I was maybe a sophomore or junior, I really wasn't comfortable reaching across racial lines because I wasn't sure how they would receive me. And I'd grown up in areas that were predominantly white. So it wasn't new to me to be in a space like that. But the unfamiliarity of it all, I was very cautious for the first couple of years.
Thank you. Hey, Edson, do you have any thoughts on that as well? What are ways in which these killings have impacted African-American students at predominantly white campus environments?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Morgan touched on a lot of how students feel. It causes additional stress. It causes more anxiety. It causes, you know, more thinking of, you know, do we belong here? You know, we can never do anything because, you know, if we try anything, they'll try to hurt us or kill us. You know, so this continued thought process of self-worth. So with this continued process of self-worth, it kind of teaches people, you know, can I really survive in this world? And, you know, as African American males, me included, we've been taught to kind of hold our feelings in and not share our feelings and kind of, you know, not kind of like tell people how we really feel. So we tend to hold a lot of things inside, you know, which causes even more anxiety, which can lead to self-harm, and that can lead to, you know, even committing suicide. You know, I'm someone who has been depressed. I'm someone who's thought about self-harm. You know, I've never attempted, which is great, but I came very close a very few times. You know, so because of this additional stress and anxiety that it brings up on African Americans, it develops this selflessness of self-doubt, and it creates depression, and it creates us to kind of question, do we even belong in this world? And, so then it creates this atmosphere that, I'm not going to allow them to hurt me. So before they get to me, I should do to myself, and so on. So that definitely creates the space for them and for African Americans to feel that way, because they have this self-doubt of, do I even belong here?
Okay, thank you. I think we need to talk about Black women too. Cecilia, historically, how have Black women like Brianna Taylor, for example, how has she been victimized, and how are we seeing similar incidents? How has that experience been similar or different as we look over history?
I think it's important to know that her story has not been as visible. And that's exactly, I think, the point that I believe Morgan also brought up over our email before, as we were preparing for this panel, is to not forget that women, particularly Black women, have also been lynched by the state and by perceived authority figures. Dating back, to during slavery, and your status as whether you were an adult or educated or pregnant or not, none of those things mattered. And a thing that I find particularly interesting to the right to life movement is that it never includes Black women in terms of thinking of their right to live and those fetuses living. When I think about pregnant women hanging from trees and fetuses cut out of bodies, and raped also. And the double trauma of rape and lynching that goes underreported and not talked about. And so the fact that Brianna Taylor was an EMT on the front lines, that we talk about coronavirus hero. She was a coronavirus hero. And that's how we need to talk about her.
Yeah, thank you so much. Robert, do you have any thoughts on that? How have Black women like Brianna Taylor been victimized by similar incidents?
Yeah, I do. I think the other part of it, which I think is dangerous, is what we see there with the emphasis on the incidents with Black men is the patriarchy of our country, right? And that we're elevating the male experience, because of the patriarchy that exists in many assets of our society that we need to challenge. And then the other piece of it is this historical thing of wanting to make an example out of Black men in an attempt to emasculate, Black men, that, we're going to do these things to you because you are perceived to be this greater threat. And so I think that also plays into, and I think, I challenge people within the media, and I'm glad that we carved out a moment at least to talk about this, because I challenge people in the media to elevate these stories of what's happening to African-American women in the same way. Because then that challenges that patriarchy, and it also challenges this idea that, which has existed, from the time of slavery, which is, I'm going to focus on things I can do to emasculate the men, right? And by doing that, and we know, Cecilia could probably quote it, I can quote some of it too, things like the Willie Lynch letter, where they go line by line. It isn't, these people, they didn't feel any need to hide what they were doing because they didn't think what they were doing was wrong. And so they went line by line and said, this is how you can remain control over these people. And so these things are entrenched in culture and society, and it's upon it. Again, all of us have to identify these things and really ask ourselves, okay, why do we do it that way? Why do we do it that way? And really challenge those parts of our society that have been, that still permeate our actions today. I think there's a responsibility that we have to do that.
Excellent, thank you. So Morgan, I had a question for you. My question was, as higher education professionals, why is it important for us to support racial justice? But interestingly enough, Anne, has a better way of words than I do. Anne is asking, is there any pushback from colleges and universities to require all students, especially white students, to engage in discussion and education about racism, about sexism, about discrimination? And then the follow-up is, what's the best way for higher education to make that shift beyond diversity and inclusion to be anti-racist? What are your thoughts on that?
So I saw that question and I appreciated it because it made me think about how at the University of Michigan, we have a race and ethnicity requirement. So in order to graduate from LSA, you have to take a certain amount of, course credits that are about these types of topics. But for a lot of students, that's just, fulfilling the requirements so that they can leave. So something that I thought about as a student was, how can we make people interested and tap into these without, the threat of not being able to get their degree? And I think that that's kind of the piece that's been missing. I haven't seen any pushback really. I know that there's been a lot of student organizations who are trying to figure out how we can kind of institute trainings beyond the curriculum. Like, I'm sure there are a lot of colleges across the country that do alcohol training and sexual assault prevention training, for incoming freshmen. So a lot of our student organizations, like the Black Student Union, different minority groups, have been thinking about how we can get one of those to be required for incoming freshmen in the same way, to just bring that to the forefront. It is not something that just stops as soon as you take a final exam. This is people's real experiences, people's real lives, and our actions have consequences. And I think that the shift from talking about diversity and equity to being anti-racist really comes from listening to the students, implementing those changes that they think are contributing to that, racist structure that we've been following for centuries. It is admitting wrongs. It is focusing on the restorative aspects of, whatever disciplinary systems that they have. I think that that's really lacking, especially like in my job as a DPE. I saw students that just felt jaded about the way that the administration would handle certain things. So it has to go beyond words. It has to be action. And it has to be dedicated to making the student feel like things are whole again, not just to save your image for the press, not just to, get the investors off your back, but really be invested in the student experience. I hope that answered that question.
I think it does. Thank you so much for that perspective. And Edson, I'm wondering the same thing from you. Do you think there has been any pushback from colleges and universities to require all students to engage in this discussion and education about racism, sexism, and discrimination? And how do we make that shift beyond diversity and inclusion to be anti-racist?
Yeah, from what I've experienced, I've never really seen a major push. There's definitely other universities that are making more of a push for the conversations than others. You would hope that all universities are pushing the same accord, but definitely you have more doing it more than others. So I think to kind of create more of this space to where they're having these conversations and pushing more of, these talks is, having more events geared towards, like a diversity training, or bring in speakers to do diversity workshops, or having a diverse learning living learning community center in your res hall, so that you can actually do programs that gears towards different ways of how to communicate with different races, people of color, people of different cultures, backgrounds, so that you understand how to gear towards those conversations. I know as my role as an administrator, I know I definitely try to, bring more events that help educate the population of different cultures and backgrounds within the university. So a main thing that I've always heard students say that they wish they had more of, especially at PWIs, is more administration of faculty of color. So if they have someone that looks at them, they'll feel more implored to go to them more and feel more to support. But I think with that, I think it's important to have, a diverse workforce, but also to bring in the right people to be involved. So you can hire 10, 20, you know, people of color, you know, in high administrative roles or as professors, but if they're not engaging or being involved with the student population, then what are they there for? So I think it's important to really bring in the right people who are involved that can help push the Black student unions, the Caribbean student associations, you know, those different types of groups to really, you know, have a voice and to get more involved and to host more events to educate the student population. As far as, you know, building more conversations in regards to racism to be anti-racist, I think everyone's pretty much has been saying today, but just building more conversation. And I think it's important to educate. People don't know how to react to situations if they don't know how to. So I think if you build more education and definitely educate, you know, people of all races of how to deal with different situations and how to communicate in those spaces, I think will help develop and help change lives. And, you know, if people are kind of don't believe some of the things that have occurred, watch movies or have videos or recommend them books to read that talks about some stuff that stuff that's occurred so that they can actually see and read what happened, you know. So in seeing it, they're like, wow, this is really accurate, that this really happened, you know. So I think doing things more of those lines will help build more conversations at universities.
Thank you for that.
If I could jump in, Mike, Edson, you reminded me of a study. I'm going to mumble through this study, but I think it's still worth mentioning, that was done a few years ago that showed that, you know, when it comes to reading, for instance, that people of color tend to read a disproportionate number of books that are written by or about issues affecting people of color, right? But that whites tend to not read very many books that tell the story or experiences of people of color, right? And so if you're in a majority group, you're not including some of these great stories that are entertaining as anything else you might read. But if you're not including that as part of your book list, like, when are you learning about the real experiences of people that are different from you, right? And so what we see is that people who come from minority groups tend to have a broader understanding. Now, part of this is because of the lack of opportunities for African-American and Hispanic writers, right? And so there just isn't enough content, right? And so we're forced to read everybody's works. But I think that's an easy place to start for people who are consuming media, to make a conscious effort to say, you know, I'm gonna read this great book by, you know, by Ta-Nehisi Coates, for instance, which is a fantastic fiction story, but it gives you some understanding of some of these experiences. And that's something that you can do to educate yourself. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't replace sitting down and talking to people, but at least it can point you towards maybe some right questions to ask.
That's helpful. Now, Cecilia, my next question is, how do incidents like this impact communities of color over time? What's interesting is Jennifer in the chat, she actually asked a more pointed question, which maybe, you know, kind of leads into that, which is that we know that there are many innocent lives that are stuck in the criminal justice system. So how can society push for criminal justice reform?
This is a long answer. Criminal justice reform. We need to take a hard look at how so-called criminal justice was formed in the first place. And I think I covered a bit of that in my, you know, little treatise earlier, as far as how criminal justice, vigilantism, and racism are really linked together. I feel like Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, really lays out beautifully the ways in which the systematic way that the United States in particular has criminalized Blackness. And there's a documentary I can't call up about convict leasing in particular, and how we see how what we now call the prison industrial complex has been a system in place for a long time, and that over-policing, under-education, over-policing, and lack of economic opportunity all lead into more Black men in prison in the United States than were enslaved in 1850. So if I have my activist me on, I say we need to abolish the system altogether and start again. We need to rebuild our society. But I think the more useful, until that day happens, we need to think about what are those wraparound services? How do we support people who are innocent and still going to prison and in prison? How do we, one of the programs I worked on in my past job at the Metro Nashville Arts Commission was restorative justice in the arts. So how do we reach those children who are incarcerated and who are deemed at risk, and through ways of, well, this is how you might be able to have a creative outlet. How do we treat those real traumas that children experience before they even get to jail? How do we support the school system in helping them not only treat those traumas, but also to reshape their own views of society? Because, teachers help to criminalize children, right? And that is what starts school systems are, hell-bent on testing that, then determines how many prison cells that one, core civic in Tennessee and in many other states will build. They check out third grade reading test scores and then plan for how many prison cells to build, right? So it is a whole other, it is a societal thing. It's not just once we get to the university level, then we have to think about those future policymakers. Who's in law school? Who's pre-law? Who's pre-med? Who is, and think about not only making diversity, equity, and inclusion a part of the core curriculum, but how do we not check in with those students? How are they taking that learning in? Well, how will that make them, how will that shape the decisions they are making and will make in the future? And so it's a whole societal, and criminal justice is an important piece, but it's only one piece of it.
Thank you for that. Robert, do you have any thoughts on that, on how these incidents impact communities of color over time, and maybe your thoughts on how society can push for criminal justice reform?
I think Cecilia said some amazing stuff just now. I'm going to repeat something that she said that's related to a study I saw last week that this may be obvious to everyone else. So I'm just going to say it out loud, which is that if you look at who our lawmakers are, you look at, I believe we've only had 1 or 2 African-American senators since Reconstruction. And so you look at who our lawmakers are, people who are making this policy, and the ethnic and diversity of those lawmakers, right? And then you realize that, the prerequisite in most cases for going into some type of political career is law school, right? Most of our politicians were lawyers. And then you walk that back to what our law schools look like, right? How diverse are our law schools, right? And so, again, it's permeating on so many different levels. But, when we don't have diverse law schools, for instance, we don't get diverse congressional representation. We don't get diverse congressional representation. And let me stop there. I'm gonna stop right there because I'm gonna say is that, you know, and those who know me know I say this all the time. What grade did you get in your high school or college diversity and inclusion course? What'd you get? Right? Because most of us are gonna have a blank stare because we never had any. Right? So now I'm looking at the people who are deciding, right, who gets in law school, and they have not been trained on any of this stuff. Right? And so they're doing what all of us do, which is our biases, right? And we connect with people that are like us. We end up with lack of diversity in law school, and then we end up with lack of diversity and representation in our political systems. And then we wonder why we end up with some of these outcomes. We wonder why we end up with some of these policies and these systemic things that are just unchanging, right? It's because we don't have the right mix of people to challenge one another. And to question some of these policies that are in place. So that would be my answer to that. I hope it helps. But you know, these things make logical sense when you start to draw the lines. They make logical sense on why we're where we are.
Thank you for sharing that. That's really important. So Morgan, my next question was, how can we best support and educate students about the challenges of racial justice? But of course, right on cue, we have attendees in the town hall that phrase the questions even better than I can come up with. So Adriana basically asked this. So many white folks say they don't know what to do to stand in anti-racism as opposed to just not being racist. Robert offered a great suggestion for white people or non-African Americans to expose and immerse themselves in Black culture and value Black voices through literature. So what are other tangible things that we can do to break with white solidarity and elevate Black voices, shield Black bodies, and be actively anti-racist?
I think that's an excellent question. When I saw it, it kind of made me think about what I would like to see from an ally or somebody who wants to be part of anti-racism, because absolutely there, to me, is a difference between not being racist and actually working to, you know, defeat the system. And something that really was helpful and meaningful for me when it came from my non-Black allies, my non-Black friends, my non-Black, you know, connections on campus, was even just tuning in when I don't have to reach out to you. You're reaching out to me to make sure that I'm okay. What can I do? What do you need from me? Those types of things, I don't take them lightly because I recognize how difficult it is to break with the, you know, majority. I understand that, especially as an in-group member. The thought of being an out-group member in a time like this, I'm sure it weighs heavy on people's minds. But I really just think that education piece, educate yourself. The same way that we look up these cases, that we look up, you know, organizations that are dedicated to these causes, you can do that too. We still have Google. We all have access to the internet. Let's apply those, you know, those resources in that way. When you see someone who has a minority identity who's being attacked, step in, be that disruptor, be that person who decides, okay, I don't want this to continue on. I'm going to step in and make sure that, you know, I can take some of that burden onto myself. So really being an interrupter, being willing to do that, not having to be, you know, forced into it because you want to. That to me is how you can take some of that pressure off of us. When you see people who are being callous towards our issues, even just stopping that narrative and inserting our humanhood when we're not even around, that is really important to me. And I'm sure that there's so many other things that they could be doing, they could be working towards, but those are just some things that came to mind when I saw that question.
Thank you, Morgan. That's an incredible answer. Edson, do you have any thoughts on that? How can we best support and educate students about the challenges of racial justice?
Yeah, so I mean, Morgan touched on a lot of, you know, the education piece and really allowing, you know, people who are not African American, kind of pushing them to serve as the voice as well. You know, so when students are hosting events, attend the event, show face. You know, when they're doing different things across campus, make sure you're right there with them. You know, if someone is doing something wrong, call them out on some of the things that they're doing. So I think with that, building allies, I think will help, because if someone who's white is being called up by someone who is white as well, then they're going to tend to think, wow, like maybe what I'm doing is, maybe to think twice of what I'm doing. But also another thing that, you know, we should do more to kind of help students kind of fight social justice is motivating them to take on more leadership roles on campus. You know, so not just being part of your organization, being an RA, being an orientation leader, serving on the programming board, serving on your student government. Serving on your student government is the biggest way for you to really get your face out there and to really help build what you're trying to do. Because being on student government, you are the face of the student body. You are the support system for the student body. So if you want to be the voice for students who don't feel they're being heard, being on student government is one of the best ways to make sure that the voices are being heard. So to add on what Morgan said about having, you know, white individuals serving as allies and calling people out and coming to our events and showing support and taking initiative and reaching out, but also using your platforms as student leaders to also get the message out. And then when you're on the student government board, you know, you're working with different people of all types of different backgrounds, races, and cultures. So being on the student government board, you're able to kind of work all together, you know, to showcase all of your achievements, stuff you want to do, things you want to implore, things you want to educate students on, things you feel that's important for the student body, things you feel that administration needs to hear and needs to know. So it's very important to take on these leadership roles because those leadership roles will help you have a voice in the long run.
That's brilliant, Edson. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Cecilia,
I was about to see if I could tag team on that last question.
Sure.
Is that okay? Yeah, I think comprehensive anti-racism training is critical. And a couple of groups that do that particularly well is Crossroads Anti-Racism. I'll put that in the chat, their website in the chat, and also Race Forward. And a critical piece for both of them is not only the comprehensive history of white supremacy in the United States that I think is critical for us all to understand and always revisit, and to really see how white supremacy keeps reinventing itself, but also how resistance also is always going on as well, and how those strategies from the past are not only inspirational, but can give us tools for how to fight racism in the present, right? And so Crossroads is one, but also forming, being able to form accountability groups is critical, particular for everybody, but for white people to work out new terminology and questions with each other without causing harm is critical for pushing anti-racism forward. And for people of color to form affinity groups by race, for Black people to talk with other Black people about racism, because all of us have, I mean, I think we're in a post-civil rights, a lot of our parents were like, you know what, racism is done. We live in an integrated society now. And so everybody is caught off guard by the racism that is happening. And so to be able to put to language your experiences is critical in safe POC space, but also for Black folks and non-Black people of color to come together to share our experiences to push strategies forward. And so I know that's something that I do in terms of helping institutions do, but there are lots of racial equity consultants out there that are equipped in helping people to do that emotional work so that you can push strategy and policy forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And then the other question that I had for you, Cecilia, is how should we respond to people who suggest that Ahmaud Arbery should have been, may have been guilty of some previous crime, or he should have avoided physical confrontation with these vigilantes.
I can't with those people.
How do I respond?
Well, how do you respond is that the way I respond is that when you live in a neighborhood and you see a house go up, we're all nosy. Neighbors are nosy. I certainly have, I may not go inside, but I'll stop and look, oh, what are they doing? And what a normal human response that is. Perhaps it is incumbent on white people to not see Black folks as criminals because we're not. Because we're Black, we are not. Everybody's not a criminal. Everybody white isn't a criminal, so everybody Black isn't a criminal. So that is what I would say to them of to fight or run. I mean, he was literally running. So what should he have done? You know, they were clearly out to hunt him. I think Edson said this earlier. They were people hunting. It's always open season on Black folks. And so this is, I really don't see this as what else could he have done? Somebody else said that about the George Floyd incident. He had already surrendered. He was not resisting arrest. You know, there are all these, there are all these things. Well, be, jovial, be respectful, be whatever. You can be all of those things and compliant and still lose your life. Philando Castile revealed that he was legally carrying a firearm and was not like, just to let you know, it's in the car, but nothing's going on here. And they shot him in front of his child and girlfriend. So, I mean, there is no justification for these killings at all. There's no reason except the fact that we think that because those men are white, they are right. And that's not it. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Robert, do you have any thoughts on that? How should we respond to people who suggest that Arbery may have been guilty of some previous crime or should have just avoided the confrontation?
I think, let me start by saying, I always like to say this in these kind of conversations, that in the same way that when I walk into a store, that I shouldn't be followed because there's a Black guy who stole something from you last week. And in that same way, every cop is not, a criminal, right? And I have family members who are police, and I worry about their life every time that they go out on the beat. And so I want to be clear about that. In what we say, that we have to be attentive to our own biases and stereotypes about one another, and that has to work both ways. It's difficult as it is. I'd also say to that, given that statement, I would ask, in particular, perhaps a white person who makes that comment. Maybe it doesn't even matter what person makes that comment. What if the person was white? What if just George Floyd? What if that had been a white man who was subdued and the cops were stepping on his neck like that? What if that had been a white? So we've had incidents where children were shot. What if it's been white children? So ask yourself that question, and then ask yourself, how would our society respond? And something in me says the society wouldn't say, well, that poor kid, that poor boy, his parents should not have allowed him to be outside with a BB gun. What's a 12-year-old boy doing with a BB gun, except that every 12-year-old boy has a BB gun, right? So I think sometimes we have to put it, sometimes you have to flip the race, if that will help you. And so before you make that comment, flip the race and ask yourself if the same rules would apply, and ask yourself further that how would you respond to it, if the races were flipped. And if I could just add a little bit more that's tangential to that comment, I think we have to, when we talk about what do we have to do going forward, I think it's one of the most important things. And more, I'm saying this, I'm telling people this, I'm internalizing this. is that white Americans have to start talking about race. They have to start talking about race. And this idea that when you bring up race, I want to clear a room of some of my white friends, start talking about race. I can get them out of there so quick. You want to get people out. If it's the end of a dinner party and you're waiting for people to leave, bring up race and you clear the room, right? Whereas people of color, we talk about race in our communities all the time. And it's not always, something that's a negative or something that there's angst around it. We talk about it in a lot of different dimensions. But in a country where race is so fundamental to how our country was formed and how the country has evolved and how it's to not be in any way comfortable with having a conversation about that topic, I think is a place for us to start talking about it. And then my last point, if I may, one more point on this to add to this, is that, and this came up a little bit earlier, but I just feel the need to repeat it again, to repeat this, is that all of us who are in an in-group, right, and everyone who's listening to this is in an in-group of some kind, right? So I want everybody to do a thought experiment in that when you're just in your in-group, whatever that may be, maybe it's young people, maybe it's old people, maybe it's this race or that race, maybe it's men, maybe, whatever it may be, think about the conversations you have about the out-group when the out-group's not there. Right? Think about the conversations that we all have about people who are in our out-group when they're not around and what those conversations are like. And do you challenge some of the negative things that are said, some of the wrong things that are said about that out-group when they're not around, right? Another place for people to start is having the courage. This stuff is hard. It's been around for hundreds of years. It's not gonna be easy. I'm sorry, I wish I could say it was easy. It isn't. It's hard. But one place to start is when, people are making comments that are inappropriate about the out-group when they're not around. Do you step forward? Do you have the courage? Can you start to build up the courage to say, okay, I didn't say anything this time, but next time I'm gonna be ready, I have a response. Things like that are things that start to dissect, start to dismantle these systems.
That's great. Thank you very much for that answer. And I know you have some great exercises to get people comfortable in talking about race that I've seen you do on college campuses. They're phenomenal. So hopefully people will reach out. I guess in closing, I'd like to start with Morgan. How optimistic are you about racism being eradicated in the next 20 years?
I wish I could say I was, super optimistic, but I'm not really sure how I can gauge that, only because I don't think that people are really ready for what a world without racism would look like. And just thinking about American society, a lot of the things that we're dealing with today are left over from the 1700s, from the 1600s. It is so deeply embedded in the different systems, from education to housing to, just money, property, all of these things. Like it is so deep. I don't think America will be ready, in the next couple of decades to really do the work to undo those systems, because there's going to be a lot of people who have to give up some things for that to happen, and I don't think that they're ready for that. I do have hope that people will begin to educate the next generations. I have hope that people will learn how to really just put in that work. So maybe in the next couple of decades, we'll get ready to get to that anti-racism stage. But in terms of it completely going away, I'm not really too optimistic about that. I wish I was, but.
Thank you. I appreciate that honesty. That's good. Edson, what do you think about that? How optimistic are you about racism being eradicated in the next 20 years?
Yeah, I'm with Morgan. Like, I don't really think racism will be eradicated. I think it will still exist, 20 years down the road. But I think what will change, and what I think it's going towards that point, I think more people are going to try to do more work to try to eradicate the acceptance of it. So I think with, education, with, doing more things to kind of build more communities together to make sure that everyone has a better understanding, I think that will improve and increase more and more. So people are more aware of how to deal with situations, how to have those conversations. To what Rob said earlier, when we're not around, are you going to call out your white friends for saying different things, and everything of that nature? So I think that will happen a little bit more. And I think a big thing of that happening was a couple of years ago with the LA Clippers, when their owner came up with those racial comments, and they said, we're not going to be accepting of this. So they took off their shirts. They didn't want to represent the Clippers. The commissioner came in hardcore and said, we're not going to tolerate this. You are banned from the NBA for life. You're no longer an owner. So I think things like that will happen a lot more as far as trying to eradicate the acceptance of racism. Now, as far as it existing, I don't think that it will be gone. But I think having more conversations like this and, building more of a space to have those conversations, I think that will grow more.
Thank you for showing us the way, Edson. We appreciate that. Cecilia, what are your thoughts on that? How optimistic are you about racism being eradicated in the next 20 years?
I'm not. However, I wouldn't be doing this work if I weren't an optimist. Racism, we're talking about hundreds of years that, started with the, movement of European states and church reformations and re-reformations, and the conversation between whether or not, who is human and who is not, who has a soul and who doesn't, who deserves to be free and who doesn't. Can a person that doesn't have a soul deserve to be free? And the ways in which they've reinvented themselves. Edson brought up the NBA. We have facets of our society, and our very society, that still replicate plantation systems. So we can't talk about eradication of racism until those systems are abolished altogether, until prisons are abolished, until we don't profit off of suffering, right? Off of people working for, people, until, that's not impossible. That's impossible. However, I am hopeful that more people will understand and hopefully change their behavior. I'm hopeful that people will do their best to change institutions that they have the power to change within themselves. I'm hopeful that, more folks in power are willing to not only pay people a living wage, but to give them power to cede some power. So I think it's a long game. White supremacy as a global moment has been forming for 500 years, and it's not just the United States, it is everywhere. I have a friend group, and we're talking about really the issues of racism. One friend is in Brazil, one friend is in the UK, and I'm here in the States. And we're talking about how institutional racism is working together globally. So we have to think of this as a long game, but not get so overwhelmed by that, that we don't think that we don't have individual power to change systems break by break.
Excellent. I'm hopeful as well. Robert, what do you think about that? How optimistic are you about racism being eradicated in the next 20 years?
That question sounds almost, in the context of this conversation, that question sounds almost juvenile, right? Mm-hmm. What do you mean racism going away in 20 years? Consider for a moment, though, that there are wide swaths of our population in the United States that don't think we have a problem with racism in the first place. Think about that. There are people who say, what do we even have in this conversation about? There's no such thing as racism anymore. That was ended. right? And so in that respect, that isn't a strange question to ask. I would say that, racism we're not going to snap our fingers, right? It's not something where in 50 years, we're going to wake up one morning and it's gone. That there will have to be work that's done in order to get to that point. And so, we all have a role to play. Wherever we are in that journey now, we have a role to play to move the ball forward. To use a sports analogy, there's not going to be some long bomb touchdown score here. We've been trying that. This is going to be, a few yards at a time. And the people who are on the planet now have a responsibility, I think, to try to move the ball forward. So the only other thing I'd say about that is I'm constantly reminded, I think of my father, who grew up in Birmingham in the 1960s. And so, if I asked him how things are going, he'd say, well, heck, they're going a lot better than they were when I was that age, right? So I'd say in connection with my father's experience, I would say, sometimes people ask me if, I'll hear people, the part of this crowd that maybe racism isn't such a big deal. They'll ask me, well, I bet you wish, we'd go back the way it used to be. And you hear that sometimes when people, the way things used to be, and there's even a political movement about how way things used to be. And I always tell people my best day, and I hope that I can always say this, and so far I've been able to say this. I live in Nashville, Tennessee. It's 2020. I tell people the best day of my life as a Black man living in Nashville, Tennessee is tomorrow. Right? The best day of my life as a Black man living in Nashville, Tennessee is tomorrow. And so as long as I can continue to say that, I feel good about that we're moving in a good direction.
That's a great perspective. Thank you so much for sharing that. I want to make sure that everybody who's listening here, whether they're live or they're listening to the recorded version, that they have an opportunity to contact each one of you if they have additional questions. So Morgan, where can people go to contact you if they have additional questions for you?
So I could say this today, but I've got my professional Twitter up and running. So if that's more comfortable, definitely I can send out an @name or something. But my LinkedIn is a great way to contact me. Email, I'm still using my university email, so I'll put that in the chat as well. I see that Edson's kind of set the standard for that. But definitely the chat box in here, if you're comfortable with that. I would absolutely love to connect on, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, wherever you want to keep the conversation forward.
Excellent. Morgan Williams, that is excellent. Edson, how about you? Where can people go to contact you if they have more questions?
Yeah, sure, man. So I posted my email address, and I also posted some of my social media handles in the group chat. So please feel free to take it down. My email address is edson.o'neill@gmail.com. My Instagram handle is biged1906. You can find me on Facebook. You can find me on LinkedIn. So those are definitely ways that you guys can reach out to me for any questions, to connect, if you guys need resources or, and honestly, if you guys need someone to talk to or vent, I'd be more than happy to serve as that resource for you guys as well.
That's excellent. Cecilia, where can people go to contact you if they have more questions? Oh, hold on. Let me take you off mute. All right.
Unmute. There we go.
There you go.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I just posted my email and Twitter and IG. My email is Cecilia Olusola.Tribble@gmail.com. Or you can follow me on Twitter or IG, @LucyLou.
Excellent. All right. Thank you very much for that. Morgan Williams is putting on her Twitter. So it's @MORGIWMS on Twitter if you want to follow Morgan. And then Robert, certainly last but not least, tell us, how can people contact you if they have more questions?
So it's robert.wilson@cultureshiftteam.com. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can also find me via Greek University at greekuniversity.org.
Excellent. I really appreciate everybody's time here. I'm going to make sure that this is, put out there for the masses as well. So we'll have this on video, so that way you can feel free to share that with your networks. And I really appreciate your time. I think this is really important conversation, and I'm happy that we were able to create this space to have this discussion. And I hope to continue the discussion on a regular basis. So thank you so much, everybody, for being here today.
Thank you for hosting. Thank you for gathering us together.
Of course, of course. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for engaging everyone. This was great.
Yeah, thank you guys for coming on and doing this. I went to Mecca about this, and then I included Rob from Cecilia and Morgan, and we were able to put together a great panel. And to all you guys who came on and have been asking great questions, giving great feedback. So again, thank you to everyone who took part today. Thank you so much without you guys, we wouldn't have made this possible. So thank you.
Great. Have a good day.